related expenditures is not done at the cost of the spending on the socio-economic sectors. Number two goes with the higher transfer of the resources to the provinces, and I think one of the chapters, it is chapter 3 which deals with it, or chapter 4, where we have also mentioned with the recently concluded 7 NFC awards, and with the higher transfer of the resources being going to the provinces, it is important for the provinces to utilize them for achieving MDG's targets. Why am I mentioning the MDG's target would make lots of sense when I mention the other recommendation which would be coming after this one, which I'm about to mention. Third is the supply bottlenecks such as gas and power load shedding, affecting the economic growth and private investment needs to be addressed on priority basis in a sustainable and cost-effective manner. I think that is by and large of great demand not only of the society but also of the industry sector. And fourth is the national goal of the poverty reduction to be considered essential for elimination of terrorism. I think it is important particularly because there exists evidence which suggests that people with a poorer background are more prone to join militant groups, and therefore extremely important not to divert. The government must not divert its focus from the poverty reduction, which is a must. Next is the skill. With the problems identified that majority of the suicide attacks as reported on electronic media and print media, that was a source, that have been carried out by the young males, number one. Number two is that if they are carried out by the young male, the second factor is that there is relatively high unemployment rate among the youth, the highest being in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And therefore, it is recommended that the skill development programs needs to be initiated for youth, both in the urban and the rural areas. More importantly, the program's design needs to be in line with the demand of the local economies, which means that they are not designed somewhere else and imposed on the provinces. It has to be the priorities, it has to be designed taking along the provincial priorities and the people working over there. The program must also have a component on youth career guidance. I think this is something which is lacking and which results into a situation that the youth is left with no sense of direction, which way to go after going for this. Sixth is that the government and the society needs to play its respective roles in strengthening the institution and ensuring the rule of law. And if I may quickly mention it, without going into detail, is address the disequilibrium which is existing between the various institutions. And I'm not going to give any further details on that. It's all understood. Equally important is to initiate dialogue involving political parties and civil society for developing consensus on its various dynamics, which means taking the stakeholders on board. I think addressing the issue in a more holistic manner, in a more total manner, would only bring results. This patchwork approach will not be able to bring the desired results. And I think the last one is, no, the second last is that I think as we were working on this study, we felt that it is extremely important because time and again we are referring to the various dynamics of the problem. So it is extremely important that we undertake the multidisciplinary, fact-based research to develop also a preventive strategy. This particular strategy of whatever problem is there of addressing terrorism must be accompanied by the preventive strategy if it is to be made sustainable across all sections of the society. Last but not the least, the recommendations of the Parliamentary Committee, which was constituted and chaired by, I think, Mr. Raza Rabbani, on the national security needs to take into account for evolving a sustainable peace plan. This parliamentary committee had formulated comprehensive strategy to deal with the issue of terrorism and national security. And I think this National Security Committee has been complaining that 14 points forwarded have not been implemented. So I think when we are talking and time and again referring that the stakeholders need to be taken on board, I think that the recommendations coming from them needs to be respected and needs to be implemented. That is very crucial to keep that participation of the various stakeholders on the issue very firmly. Concluding, one can say that military offensive against militants is necessary, which is selective use of force, but not a sufficient strategy. It is extremely important both for the international players, the regional players, and our own government to ensure a balance between the military and the civil surge strategies. Equally important, it is to develop a shared vision to escape from the quagmire of terror. Thank you for a very patient hearing. It was difficult summarizing it, but I think we have been able to bring forward some of the major findings, but we would at some point be taking the question and answers. But thank you for a very patient hearing.
And we'll have a good question and answer session. I will now request Dr. Hafiz Pasha to please share his remarks and comments on the annual review.
This is the 10th annual review of the Social Policy and Development Center. And I feel proud in having been associated with this civil society organization. And as I was looking at the annual report, I was reminded that 10 years ago, SPDC came out with a similar report with a slightly different title. It was Social Impact of the Economic Crisis, which Pakistan was facing at the time when nuclear sanctions were imposed upon us. And Sardar Aziz Saab and I had a very difficult job of managing the economy at that time. SPDC has developed a reputation for independent, and I would like to think, objective research. Take 2 or 3 of the annual reviews. Way back in 2004, SPDC was probably one of the first few agencies highlighting that this kind of growth orientation of the then government was probably not adequate for poverty reduction, and that there was a danger that inequality was rising sharply. And recent years, the research has confirmed this view of SPDC. In fact, at that time, SPDC had to pay a heavy price in its confrontation with the then military government. More recently, SPDC has produced what I think was a remarkably objective report on devolution and human development. This report in 2006-07 examined what the implications were of the implementation of the devolution plan, highlighted its weaknesses, but did recognize that there were some positive outcomes, and suggested a strategy which was not one of discarding it completely, but of evolution and development of the local government system. I must say I remain somewhat disappointed about what's been happening to local governments in Pakistan recently. This report, Social Development in a Security Crisis, takes on a particularly sensitive issue. It required courage, especially the surveyors who went into the affected areas and talked to the affected people. This was a task which even the board had to deliberate on as to whether this was feasible. And I must say that the human side behind those numbers is really extraordinarily touching and vivid in character. When something like 60% of the people are suffering from severe psychological or mental stress, when poverty has doubled in those affected areas, this side of the war on terror and the costs, human costs thereof, I believe have not been sufficiently highlighted in Pakistan. And I'm indeed very grateful to SPDC for having taken the initiative and the courage to go out there in the affected areas and talk to the people. That to me is the singularly most important part of this report. Yes, there is a lot more. This is in fact a relatively rich and sometimes, if I may suggest, difficult to read report in terms of the wealth of material that has been assembled by SPDC. It will become a compendium of thoughts on what's happening to Pakistan on the war on terror. Now there are some other very striking conclusions. The first to me is the fact that when you look at the macroeconomic impact, you look at the fiscal impact, you look at what's happening to the social indicators, it appears that this war on terror, which we took upon ourselves in the earlier part of the last decade, did confer some significant positive benefits until, say, 2005. The economy grew faster, the social indicators did better, and probably there was a reduction in poverty. So we have to recognize that in the initial phase of this war on terror, because of the increased inflow of resources and the fact that our fiscal position improved because of the support, particularly from the international community, Pakistan did better. But increasingly, as elements of confidence were affected and as the costs increased, particularly in light of the intensification of the military operations in the north, Pakistan has had to pay an increasingly huge costs. You may disagree with the numbers. The government's estimate is $11.5 billion last year. Our estimate, SPDC's estimate, is $10 billion. These are very large magnitudes. Something like 5 to 6% of our economy has been reduced. And more importantly, while we have tried to manage the domestic situation, the support from the international community has been a mere fraction, perhaps not even 1/3 of the costs that we have borne. So, we are at a point where the rise in the costs has become very visible. I'll just take you through one or two numbers. If you look at the fiscal impact, more recently of the war on terror, the report says that the additional cost of the defense forces and the police to Pakistan, as compared to the counterfactual, which is that if we had not gone into this war on terror, is about 300 billion rupees. That's the extra bill that we are carrying directly in fighting this war on terror, due to the expansion and the enhancement in salaries thereof, so on police and defense forces. We are receiving reimbursement for some of our military operations in the north to the tune of about 120 billion rupees. So the net cost to us, purely in terms of security, is about 180 billion rupees. And when you add on the revenue implications of the foregone growth that Pakistan has experienced in the last 3 years particularly, overall the fiscal cost in terms of lost revenues, in terms of higher expenditure on the security side only, are probably about 300 billion rupees. That's 1/3 of your deficit. Last year's deficit was about 9